Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Walking Digital Corridors. This morning, we are talking about storytelling for differentiation. So last week, if you joined us, we were talking about storytelling. We kind of touched on we kind of touched on the importance of telling your personal stories or stories that you can tell to create a stronger connection with someone that you perhaps haven't met yet, or you've met but you haven't had an opportunity to, to build rapport. And so, today's discussion is really about looking at stories that you can tell that differentiate you, but also the value proposition in the company that you represent, as a way to kind of really, if we think about driving a competitive advantage today, and for the most part, we all sound the same. So, what stories can we tell that differentiate us and the value proposition that we provide to our customers and our buyers? And I am joined by
Jordan Abbott, also known as the sales poet. I guess the sales poet sort of lends itself to the topic. I try to tell stories in outside of the box ways, and one of the ways that I do that is by creating parody music videos. Make a bit of a tit out of myself in the process, but I have good fun.
You do, and good videos they are, I must say. Cool. So in order to kick the conversation off this morning, I wanted to frame the most effective way to view storytelling, because I think there are no shortage of storytelling courses out there, and I'm sure many of our listeners have been through some sort of storytelling training. But I think the thing for me that is missing for the most part is really bringing into focus what your commercial objectives are, and for that year, and where you might be tracking in terms of your performance for that year. So what is your current pipeline? What's your confidence within that pipeline? How strong do you believe it is? Where do you feel the gaps are within your pipeline? And so how can stories that you design help you overcome some of those challenges as a salesperson, and achieve your commercial objectives? And so, as I touched on already, last week it was about stories that help build a stronger connection and build rapport. Today it's about stories for differentiation, and I want to dig into a success story framework, really, because if we think about the fact that if we have a qualified opportunity, it's relatively easy to then look at where we might be in that sales process, or where our buyer might be in the buying process, and then we think about designing a story that would apply to that situation. We're not always lucky enough to have many of those, and so what about the use case for when we're struggling to connect or meet with our territory, and then telling that story or creating that story that you can then use on your social media to try and engage your audience. Now, a lot of, for many years, in fact, I would use case studies, AKA a success story. But for the most part, those case studies would be written as if the vendor I was representing was the hero. And actually, when you think about it, that's quite egotistical. And one challenge we have as salespeople is when we open our mouths, buyers, for the most part, choose not to believe us. Certainly not until they've built some degree of trust between us. And so, for me, the most effective type of success story is a success story where the client that we worked with is the hero, And we, as in the company that we work for, was the guide. You know, we came in, we helped the client understand the problem that they're facing, and together we worked out a plan that would help them avoid failure and achieve success. You know, very similar to to Luke Skywalker and his mission to blow up the Death Star, and Obi-Wan Kenobi being the guide to help him achieve that.
Yeah.
So you know, what examples have you got, Jordan, of, you know, telling stories, and how do you kind of view storytelling, specifically success storytelling?
Yeah, I just to sort of to a point that you just made surrounding the perspective that you're telling the story from. I think case studies or success stories, as you said, fairly egotistical, and I think it sort of portrays the solution as the silver bullet.
Mm.
As we know, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
There is a lot of work that needs to be done by the customer, by the client, to drive adoption and to really get the most out of the technology, the service, whatever it may be. So I think it's, you know, it's an opportunity to set the expectations early on that, okay, there is going to be stuff that needs to be done in your side. I'm just ahead of the show as well. I was doing a bit of research, and there's a piece of research by cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner. I've probably butchered the pronunciation there, but facts that are wrapped into a story are 22 times more memorable than facts alone.
Say that again. The dogs were barking.
No worries, no worries. So facts that are wrapped into a story are 22 times more memorable than facts alone. So at any point within that that process, the sales process, the buying process, there is a place for a differentiation story.
Yeah.
If we're thinking about trying to stand out, you know, gestalt thinking, if you're familiar, basically, if we look like everybody else, we're in a room with 15 other people that we're competing against, our chance of being remembered is 1 in 16.
Yeah.
If we look different in some way, it's you know, they see them or us. If, you know, you're further into the sales process, the buying process, and you are competing against 2-3 others, rather than just throwing facts, uplifts at the wall, how much more powerful would it be if you had a story which exemplified the impact that you had, right? And given that it's more memorable, given that it's more impactful, when your champion is trying to build consensus, as you said, you know, Luke Skywalker with the team, it's really about trying to get everyone on side, and storytelling is a great way to do that.
Yeah. And making sure, when we think about the structure of a good story, making sure there are those complications in there.
Yeah.
You know, we know real life isn't a bed of roses, and so our buyers see through that when we tell stories that are full of success.
Yeah.
And you know, your point about being memorable, I think when there's complication and the story is unpredictable, it's more memorable because the recipient is listening more intently.
Yeah. I love beat me to it. I love Mark's point. It's a really great point, because you have people that collect these various items,
Mm.
that material item probably doesn't mean much in itself. It's about the story that it represents, right?
Yeah, it really is. And how many times have we been in a conversation and with a potential customer, and it's easy to rattle off the facts.
Yeah.
In our case, the fact is almost the product. It's the bottle of whiskey. It's easy to rattle off the facts. If we think about Tech Lubiertz and the fact that I've been working with Tech now for 18 months, and he's had some amazing results. So increased territory penetration by 15 times, increased the number of meetings that he's generated by 36 times, increased the number of stakeholders by 6.4 times. These are all numbers, they're facts. When you actually talk about the fact that, Tech was feeling the pain after 5 months, having only scheduled one meeting between him and his SDR, and he was getting incredibly worried because people around him were being made redundant, and he'd not long moved to a new region with his girlfriend and his dog Atos, and the last thing he needed was to be made redundant when he was saving for a deposit on his dream home. He had to get a mortgage. You don't get a mortgage when you're made redundant. Yet 5 months after working together, he'd achieved all of those results, those facts that I mentioned. But the best thing about the story is the fact that, he enters a new year with 70% of his H1 pipeline committed. And the best thing, him and his girlfriend and his dog Atos moved into their dream home.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Mark, I'd love to hear some of those stories. No
Yeah.
doubt after you've cracked a bottle or two open.
No, it's a great point. I think I think it's completely necessary and something that we're sort of seeing across the board. It's taking that sort of layer deeper, and as we're talking, not sure why, but the sort of growing prominence of the sort of sports focused documentaries comes to mind, and I think that there is a link, or in my mind at least, tell me how legitimate it is. But when you think of sports, it's typically very data driven, right? Someone wins, someone loses, someone scores so many goals, someone qualifies on pole with this time, and we're watching it live. But the success of Formula One recently is, or the growing prominence of Formula One recently is largely down to the stories that are going on behind the scenes that are being told or shown on Drive to Survive. It's you're building that closer relationship to the fans in that instance, but in a B2B world, it's those stories, that relatability, that differentiation in people's minds that really dictates the success or failure. I was chatting with someone the other day that was talking about Sales Loft and the content, and he was saying, if I think of Sales Loft, I don't really seem to remember seeing any of their content on any socials. But when I see that Sales Loft logo, my mind goes to Tom Boston or Charlotte Johnson. These people that are telling these stories in outside of the box ways, and that is creating that differentiation in people's minds.
Yeah, and how people can relate to the humour, to the challenge that they might be, making funny or making fun of. I think that's you've hit the nail right on the head there. It's the challenge in the story is so important, because that's what your buyer will or will not relate to. And I think that's why vanilla success stories and case studies just don't cut it, because they're the same story that everyone in your organization is going to tell. You've got to take that story and tailor it to the individual in which you're telling it to, and understanding in great detail that story, and highlighting the complication within that story that is relevant to your buyer. I think if you do that, that's when your buyer, your recipient that you're telling your story to, is going to be relating to the story. That's when they're going to be putting themselves into your story in their own mind.
Yeah.
And that's when the connections are really made.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's hard to connect with facts. If you can tell that story, try and encourage that sort of catharsis, and that, as you said, putting themselves in that position, trying to think of how they'd feel, how they'd react, or maybe not putting themselves in that position, but having that aha moment where it's like, do you know what? My team's been feeling this for so long. We hadn't thought about it in this way. That's quite intriguing.
Yeah. The other thing I think with storytelling is it's very easy to create a story with too much detail in it, too many facts. You feel like, well, I've got to tell the recipient everything that happened, and actually,
similarly to a demo, that vanilla demo, I'm going to show them everything, and it's just overwhelming.
Yeah, exactly. But actually, the best story, perhaps unlike a demo, but the best story is when you're leaving something to the imagination, so that your recipient, your buyer is able, they have the freedom to put themselves into your story that you're telling, and think about how it relates to them. I think when there's too much detail, it has a counterintuitive effect, the opposite effect that you really want. Hi, Peter. Nice to see you. I should probably say at this point, in case anyone was wondering why Jensen isn't here, he had a spider bite this week and had a funny reaction to it, and has had to go to the doctors, and he's on antibiotics. I'm pleased to say that he's recovering very well, but he was dehydrated and had really low blood sugar levels as a result. So he's not feeling too great. So Jensen, we miss you today, and get well soon.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be back next week, and we'll have Peter Parker joining us.
Indeed. And if anyone knows Jensen, that is funny, because he will undoubtedly be thinking that he's turning into Spider-Man with superpowers. But yeah, great question here, Jensen. What would be your top tip to keep the recipient engaged with your story? So I think there's a few things. Shall I tackle that first, Jordan?
Yeah, go on.
I think firstly, you need to design a story within a framework that has specific events. That's the first thing. So, if it's a relatively simple story, you can use 4 events. If anyone's familiar with the simple story framework, there's a setting, there's a complication, there's a turning point, and then there's a resolution. By using a framework, it's easy for your recipient to understand your story. The second thing is need to have a sequence of events. If you have a sequence of events and you're sort of framing timelines, touching on timelines, it's easy for your recipient to follow. They don't get lost in your words. Then I think you need unpredictability. So as human beings, we typically, our minds will predict things, right? If you're telling a story that's predictable, it's very easy for someone just to switch off because they feel like they know the outcome of the story. If you make sure there is surprise, unpredictability, fear, like emotions in your story, then you'll keep your recipient engaged. And then finally, I would say you've got to have a business point. So even if you're telling a personal story, make sure you have a business point that's relevant to the person that you're talking to. I don't know if you'd add anything there, Jordan.
Yeah, not necessarily to the actual storytelling, like in the moment. I think it comes back to what you do before with the research and the preparation. So whenever I was acting, the rehearsals, that repetition will bring to light other sort of nuances each time you do it. So you'll learn different ways of telling it. Where can I put the emphasis here? What does that affect? But then additionally, the research, so that you can ensure that the story is going to be relevant.
Yeah.
So research ahead of the call, and it doesn't have to be, perfect. And there's a great post that I saw ages ago from Sherry Levetkin that was talking about trying to find that commonality. And it doesn't need to be, oh yeah, we both love gardening. It could be, the prospect loves running. I may hate running, but where's that connection between what they love doing or what they're trying to achieve and what I'm trying to achieve? So in that running analogy, the prospect or the person that she was speaking to said, it feels like a moving meditation for me. And at that point, Sherry was like, well, I love yoga. That's my equivalent. That's my meditation. So it's trying to find that commonality where that will encourage the person to put themselves in those shoes without it being, completely prescriptive and, oh, I noticed you went to Starbucks at 9:32 on Thursday morning. I also went to Starbucks, and while I was at Starbucks, I was thinking, how can I increase my meeting generation rate by 4x? And it was that point that I thought about, which is completely unbelievable, trying to get to that business point by something that's completely unrelatable. So, I think it's that research, that prep, and then just the repetition, because you want to know your story so well that in the moment you can react to how something's being told, or you've just done some intros and someone's told you a story about what they did on their weekend, and you can take a little bit or tailor the story to include that so it feels even more relatable.
So just on that, let me add a point, because it's so important what you just said. The research for me is twofold. There's the research into the design of the story. So who am I going to interview? Preparing the list of questions, and have 10, 15 different questions that you can ask people involved in the story, if it's not a personal story, obviously, to understand every single angle, every single perspective in relation to that storyline. And then I think, making sure that you understand who the person is that you want to deliver the story to. And the more you know about them, the more you can tailor your story. And this doesn't have to be War and Peace. This could be just a 1 to 2 minute story that you tell in the moment.
Yeah.
It could be a blog post that you write, or an article that you write. It could be a video that you create, which, you know, together provides this, you know, this approach, this asynchronous approach that you can deploy depending on where your buyer, your customer is in the buying process. And then practice, right? You know, practice, practice, practice. So I don't know if you can read all of that, and perhaps you can tell me what the 12th man video is, Jordan. I don't recall that, but Jensen's saying, awesome tips. Following on from Jordan's point, let's say we have our story with a framework, but we struggle with the delivery. Would you slow it down and change tone? When I think about storytelling, I think of Jordan's 12th man video.
Yeah. So yeah, tone, pace, they're all things that we can change. The what is it? The 7, 18 and 65% rule or something. I think it's shortened as the 7% rule. So when we communicate, only 7% of that communication exchange is via the words we actually say. Then there's a larger percentage that is the tone, the way we say it, and then an even larger percentage which is our body language, right? So they're all things that are going to influence how that story is received and the message that we're actually getting across. So they're all things that we can play with to change the impact.
It reminds me, people don't remember what you say, but they do remember how you make them feel.
Yeah, and that's what that's the objective here, right? And then the 12th man video that Jensen's referring to, it was a piece that I did a while back about football hooliganism and corruption in
yeah. The 12th man being the additional man on the football pitch, or woman, person.
Yeah.
Good, brilliant discussion. I feel like we could carry on talking for hours, but I think we've got to end it there. Thank you, Jordan, the sales poet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jensen, for your contribution today, even though you weren't here in person. And to Mark and Peter and Jackie for your comments this morning. Thank you all. Until next time on Walking Digital Corridors, I feel like we should continue on the theme of storytelling, but perhaps go into the, enter the end of the purchase process or the buying process, where building consensus is often one of the hardest things for salespeople to do effectively. And so let's talk about storytelling through that lens. All right. Enjoy the rest of your week, folks.